What's up guys, welcome back, hope you're all doing well. If you happen to be watching this video on the day of upload, AMD's Ryzen 5 stack of desktop processors based on the new Zen architecture is now here for the taking, hitting store shelves and select retailers around the globe. The 4 chips in the R5 lineup trail behind the existing Ryzen 7 family in both performance and price, making them a direct competitor to Intel's Core i5 Kaby Lake processors, giving mainstream gamers and content creators a wider range of options for the first time in years. Today we'll be focusing on 2 of the R5 SKUs that were sent over by AMD, the 1600X and 1500X, which are priced to directly compete with Intel's Core i5 7600K and 7500 respectively. Assuming I can get my hands on them, let me know in the comments if you'd like to see content pieces on the remaining R5 SKUs, the 1600 and 1400. Like Ryzen 7, R5 fits the AM4 socket and supports SMT for improved performance in multi-threaded applications over Intel's Core i5 SKUs, which do not support hyperthreading. The 1600X sports 6 cores and 12 threads, which look intimidating next to the 7600K, a base clock of 3.6 GHz with XFR single-core boost to 4.0 GHz, and a 95-watt TDP. The 1500X's 4 cores and 8 threads offer a slight bump over the 7500, while shipping with a 3.5 GHz base frequency and single-core turbo to 3.7. With a TDP of only 65 watts, the 1500X gets bundled with AMD's WRAITH Spire, which is a great value add that can save users a chunk of change on an aftermarket cooler. You can check out my full review of the WRAITH Spire for more info. While the pricing from both camps is competitive, it's worth noting that Ryzen 5 also benefits from its overclocking support on cheaper B350 and X300 boards, allowing users to harness more power out of their chips for less money compared to Intel. Speaking of overclocking, all 4 CPUs were manually tweaked for today's tests. As you can see here, the 1600X was able to hit 4.1 GHz, whereas the 1500X pulled off a 4.0 GHz OC without having to increase voltages. It appears having fewer cores than the 8-core R7 1700 has helped Ryzen 5 hit higher frequencies, as we saw the 1700 struggle to surpass 3.9 GHz unless of course you struck the silicon lottery. A 16 gig of G.Skill Trident Z DDR4 3200 was paired with all SKUs, as this was the fastest DDR4 kit I had on hand, though I could not get the memory stable above 3000 MHz when using the 1500X, so we may have to wait for a BIOS update before we can retest the chip and memory at its rated speed. Fortunately, with a bit of tweaking, the 1600X had no problems taking the 3200 MHz frequency with the kit's default settings of 14, 14, 14, 14, 34. Diving into thermals, all SKUs were fitted with air coolers operating at 100% fan speed. Noctua's NH-U12S accompanied our Ryzen 5 CPUs, while the Cooler Master Hyper 212 Turbo assisted our Kaby Lake contenders. Having identical coolers so we could make direct thermal comparisons would have been ideal, but I don't currently have an appropriate cooler for this test with 1151 and AM4 brackets, so I'm sorry, this is the best I could do for now. Intel temperatures were tracked with Hardware Monitor, and AMD temps were recorded using the latest version of Ryzen Master. It's important to note here that this updated version of the software now displays accurate temperatures for all existing Ryzen SKUs, as opposed to earlier versions reporting that 20 degrees Celsius offset for 95-watt parts in particular, which was quite misleading. When running GTA 5 with the aforementioned overclocks and an ambient of 25 degrees Celsius, the 1600X hovered in the high 50s and low 60s, staying significantly cooler than the 7600K, which at one point hit 80 degrees Celsius. Our 1500X rarely saw temperatures go above 60°C, staying mostly in the 50s, and the 7500 performed similarly, if not coming into the low 60s a tad more often. Overall, I found the Ryzen 5 thermals to be very reasonable, and with that 1600X running around 20 degrees cooler than the 7600K, users won't have to invest quite as much money into a third-party aftermarket cooler to keep their chip under control. Now here's a full look at the testing hardware. In an effort to not bottleneck our CPUs much, I decided to test both platforms with the GTX 1070 Founders Edition running stock. Version 378.92 was the latest WCL driver when I began my Ryzen 5 testing, but it's worth noting that version 381.65 has since become available. I should also mention that at the time of filming we are using the latest Windows updates and BIOS version 0515. All games were tested at 1920 by 1080 since it's more likely to create a CPU-limited environment, though I've also added 2560 by 1440 as it's an increasingly popular resolution for gamers purchasing CPUs within this price range. So, moving forward with our first set of data in Cinebench R15, which measures single and multi-threaded CPU performance, the 1600X dominates the multi-threaded test unsurprisingly, with 1382 marks, the 1500X being runner-up with 903. In the single-threaded run, however, the 7600K carries a 28% lead over the 1600X with a score of 214. This also comes as no surprise, as Ryzen 7 has already shown us Kaby Lake's single-core advantage over Zen. There may be an exception to this rule at the lower end, though, as here the 7500 and 1500X yield identical single-core performance. In 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme, we see Ryzen 5 beating out both of their respective Intel competitors in the overall score, with a smaller lead for Intel in the graphics department, perhaps indicating the GTX 1070 is being slightly more bottlenecked by our Ryzen chips. In Ashes of the Singularity at 1080p, the 7600K takes a 9% lead in average frame rates over the 1600X, with comparable 1% and 0.1% lows. Similarly, the 7500 achieved an 8% higher average FPS than the 1500X. However, our 4-core Ryzen 5 chip delivers favorable lows. At 1440p, we see the game become more GPU-bound, closing the performance gap a bit. The 7600K yields a 6.5% higher average frame rate than the 1600X, whereas the 1500X and 7500 keep neck and neck until factoring in the 7500's poor frame time performance, indicating a much choppier experience than its competitor. In Battlefield 1 at 1080p, the 7600K scores an average FPS 5% higher than the 1600X, again with similar lows, while the 7500 takes a 2.5% lead on average, but trails behind the 1500X in 1% lows. Also notice how the cheaper 7500 beats out the 1600X in average FPS, albeit with slower frame times. Crank it up to Quad HD and we see 2 to 3% leads from Intel in average frame rates, with slightly higher frame time performance from AMD. Ryzen 5 takes a sizable backseat in Doom at 1080p, with the 7600K scoring 11% higher averages than the 6-core Ryzen chip, and the 7500 averaging 16% better than the 1500X. This time, the 7500 edges out the 1600X by a wide margin. Ryzen frame times also took a dive, with up to a 31% deficit compared to Kaby Lake. Naturally, the higher resolution levels the playing field. At 1440p, Ryzen comes within 3% of the Core i5's average FPS, with lows performing between 4 and 11% slower. Once again, we see Intel leading, this time in GTA 5 at 1080p. With average frame rates, the 1600X falls behind the 7600K by 13%, while the 1500X trails the 7500 by 18%. At 1440p, Intel leads by a slight margin across the board, with all SKUs averaging over 60 FPS. In Hitman at 1080p, the 7600K delivers 8% more frames on average than its competitor, while the 7500 sees an increase of roughly 5%. Our unlocked Core i5 takes a victory point for slightly higher 1% and 0.1% lows as well. The 1600X and 7500 practically mirror performance at 1440p, and the 7600K takes the lead in average FPS and frame times, as we might expect by now. In Metro Last Light at 1080p, the 7600K offers 5% more performance than the 1600X when it comes to average frame rates, but tanks with its 0.1% lows, as does the 7500, and this is also the only measurable difference between the 7500 and 1500X. The trend of poor Kaby Lake 0.1% lows continues at 1440p, with similar 1% performance across the board and marginal gains over Ryzen in average FPS. Our last game is Watch Dogs 2, and at 1080p we see a fairly tight performance gap between SKUs, likely due to our GTX 1070 being limited in this GPU-intensive title. Still, the Intel gang pulls ahead by around 4 to 6% on average, but shares similar lows with Ryzen. Finally, in 1440p, we see identical performance across all chips as the game becomes even more GPU-bound. Now, averaging all the data from our 7 gaming benchmarks, we can see here that at 1080p, the 7600K offers 6% higher average FPS than the 1600X, with slightly faster 1% and 0.1% lows. While it's by a small margin, this makes the unlocked i5 the faster gaming chip while offering more value, as it is $10 cheaper than the 1600X. For users only interested in gaming, the data points to the 7600K being the higher performing option, but gamers who perform tasks such as live streaming or video editing should strongly consider the 1600X for its extra cores and threads that put the i5 to shame in multi-threaded workloads. If you purchase the 1600X, the gains in heavily threaded tasks will be great, and the sacrifice in gaming performance will be slight. you know, unless you're playing Doom or GTA 5, then get wrecked. Another consideration here is the 7500, since it matches the performance of the 1600X on average, but costs 20% less. If you only care about gaming and are using a GTX 1070 or slower at 1080p, the 7500 can be a great value over the 1600X and the 7600K based on these results. When compared to the 1500X, the 7500 rendered 8% more frames on average, but comes in at a $10 premium. Still, the 7500 is the wiser choice for a gaming audience, unless those users also happen to be content creators in some form who can benefit from the extra threads on the 1500X, but we'll have to do more multi-threaded testing on that in the future. I will say it is nice to see that the 1600X is outperforming the 1500X by a good 7 to 8%. It would have been a real disappointment had we encountered another situation like we did with the R7 1700, essentially making the 1800X obsolete through overclocking. Although, to be fair, in this case we are dealing with a different core and thread count between the chips. Again, averaging all the data, Kaby Lake still takes the lead at 1440p, but only by 5% for the 7600K and 3% for the 7500 over their respective competitors in average frame rates. 1% and 0.1% lows are nearly identical between all SKUs. For users gaming at 1440p, this narrow performance gap makes a stronger case for Ryzen 5, especially since greater core and thread optimization seem to be where the industry is headed. In closing, Kaby Lake is still the crown holder when it comes to pure gaming performance, but Ryzen 5 isn't far behind, and will hopefully only improve as more developers optimize their games for the Zen architecture. Not to mention, Ryzen is still the more versatile and affordable option for those branching outside the realm of gaming. But that's all I've got for now, guys. Feel free to share your thoughts on Ryzen 5 so far in the comments. I'm very curious to hear them. Blow it up down below, and don't forget to toss me a like on this video if you enjoyed it. It helps me very much. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see y'all in the next video.